Two people can graduate the same year, take jobs in the same city, and earn almost identical salaries. 10 years later, one of them owns investments, sleeps without financial stress, and has genuine freedom over their choices. The other is still living paycheck to paycheck, wondering where the money keeps disappearing to. Same income, same city, same decade, completely different outcomes. So what actually separated them? It wasn't intelligence, it wasn't luck, and strangely, it wasn't even income. It was a handful of quiet financial turning points, the kind nobody posts about, the kind that don't show up on a resume. Most people cross them by accident, years too late, if they cross them at all. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most people don't realize they miss these turning points until their 30s, when the gap between where they are and where they expected to be suddenly feels impossible to close. This is the story of those turning points, and why hitting them early quietly changes everything that follows. The first one has nothing to do with money at all. School teaches almost nothing about this, so most people learn it the hard way. Your 20s were never really the decade for building wealth. They're the decade for building the behavior that eventually builds wealth. Picture two graduates. One earns $85,000 a year. The other earns $55,000. 5 years pass and the lower earner has the higher net worth. That result sounds backwards. It isn't, once you understand what's actually happening underneath it. Income doesn't create wealth on its own. It amplifies whatever behavior already exists. Hand it to someone with poor money habits, a bigger paycheck simply funds bigger mistakes faster. So the real starting milestone isn't a six-figure salary. It's proving you can direct money on purpose before money starts directing you. And that battle almost always begins with the same opponent. Debt doesn't just cost money, it costs
choices. Every dollar owed quietly narrows the future. Carrying high-interest debt makes it harder to leave a job that's draining you, harder to take a risk on something better, harder to move somewhere your life could actually improve. Every decision gets filtered through the same exhausting question: can I still make the payment? That's not stability. That's a leash. Not all debt behaves this way. A mortgage or an education loan used with intention can open doors instead of closing them. But high-interest consumer debt, credit card balances rolled month to month, buy now, pay later purchases stacking quietly in the background, these drain the future without announcing it. One of the earliest real milestones is simple to state and surprisingly hard to reach. Owing less than your money can comfortably earn. Past that point, a paycheck stops repairing yesterday and starts building tomorrow for the first time. But here's what almost nobody tells you next. Getting out of debt doesn't make you safe. It just clears the runway. Ask anyone what would happen if their income vanished tomorrow. Most people go quiet because the honest answer is uncomfortable. For a huge share of working adults, the runway before real trouble starts is measured in weeks, not months. That's not because disaster is guaranteed. It's because uncertainty always is. A car breaks down. A position gets eliminated. A health bill arrives with no warning attached. This is why people who've built real financial security stop thinking of savings as money sitting idle. They think of it as bought options. A cash reserve isn't just protection. It's leverage. The ability to say no to a bad job, a bad deal, a bad landlord, without desperation making the decision for you. A reasonable early target is 3 to 6 months of essential expenses, sitting somewhere accessible, not invested, not locked away. The number matters less than what it does to the brain. Once basic survival stops being a live
threat, a completely different kind of thinking becomes possible for the first time. Growth. Not panic-driven decisions, actual growth. Ask anyone who invests which dollars felt hardest to save, and almost everyone gives the same answer. Not the biggest amount, the very first meaningful one. Every early dollar saved feels painfully slow, almost pointless, invisible against how far there is to go. This is exactly where most people quietly quit, right before the part that would have made it worth continuing. Then something shifts. The number stops feeling random and starts feeling like proof. Proof that you're someone who saves, someone who invests, someone playing a longer game than most people around them. That identity is worth more than the balance itself, because the mountain that matters most is always the first one. Every climb after that gets easier, not because the math changes, but because the doubt does. Now here's where the story usually turns, and where most people quietly lose the progress they just built. A raise arrives. The apartment gets nicer. The car gets newer. The subscriptions multiply. None of it feels reckless in the moment. Every single purchase feels earned, deserved, reasonable on its own. But here's what's actually happening underneath. Every dollar spent upgrading today's life is a dollar that can no longer buy tomorrow's freedom. Income rose. Spending quietly rose to match it. The gap that was supposed to build wealth simply never opened. This is why so many people earning genuinely impressive salaries still feel stuck living paycheck to paycheck. Not because they earn too little, because every raise instantly becomes a new baseline instead of new ground gained. The people who build lasting wealth usually aren't the ones earning dramatically more. They're the ones who kept living roughly like their earlier selves while quietly investing the difference. From the outside, this often looks boring. A reliable car instead of an
Impressive one. A modest home instead of a statement one. That's not an accident. It's the entire strategy, hiding in plain sight. Real wealth rarely looks like anything. Visible wealth and actual freedom are two different currencies, and spending one usually means having less of the other. The psychology gets even more interesting once you start investing, because time behaves in a way most people underestimate completely. Waiting for the perfect moment, more income, more knowledge, a calmer market, feels responsible. It rarely is. Every year of waiting is a year compounding never gets to work with. Someone investing modest amounts consistently through their 20s routinely ends up ahead of someone investing much larger amounts starting a decade later, not through skill, but purely through time. Think of it less like planting a single seed and more like a river slowly carving a canyon. Nothing dramatic happens in year 1, or year 2, or even year 5. The shape only becomes obvious decades later, once you look back at how far the water actually cut. Consistency, not excitement, is what carves that canyon. Chasing the next hot idea rarely beats simply staying invested through the boring years, the ones nobody talks about. There's a milestone hiding underneath all of this that rarely gets its own headline. Most people spend their entire 20s with exactly one source of income and exactly one point of failure. If that single employer disappears, so does everything. The fix isn't quitting a stable job to chase 10 side projects at once. It's proving, even in a small way, that income isn't fixed. A skill sold outside of work. A small project that earns quietly in the background. Nothing dramatic, just enough to prove the ceiling can move. Once that idea actually lands, it changes how every future decision gets made. And of every investment available in your 20s, the highest return rarely comes from a brokerage account at all. It comes from
skill, negotiation, communication, a technical craft. The ability to explain complicated things simply. Markets rise and fall on their own schedule. A genuinely useful skill doesn't get wiped out in a downturn. It just keeps compounding quietly, whether the headlines are calm or chaotic that year. There's one more shift worth naming, quieter than the others, but just as important. Most people spend their 20s thinking like consumers, constantly asking what they can afford to buy next. A smaller number start asking a completely different question. What can I own that keeps producing value long after the initial effort is finished? A skill that compounds. A small investment that grows without daily attention. Anything built once that keeps paying afterward. That single mental shift from spending toward owning is what quietly separates people who eventually gain options from people who stay busy earning them and never actually catch them in. So here's the real takeaway underneath every milestone in this story. The specific numbers you hit were never really the point. 10,000 saved, debt cleared, 6 months of expenses covered. Those milestones matter, but only because of what they force you to become along the way. Someone with strong financial habits eventually reaches impressive numbers almost by default. Someone with weak habits tends to lose impressive numbers just as easily, no matter how high the starting income was. Your 20s were never really about becoming rich. They were about becoming financially hard to knock down, dangerous enough to walk away from a bad job, calm enough to invest while everyone else panics, patient enough to think in decades instead of weeks. None of that arrives through one big decision. It arrives through thousands of small, unremarkable ones, repeated quietly, long after anyone else is paying attention. If this kind of thinking about money and behavior is useful to you, subscribe.